Welcome, flute players. Welcome to 3 tips for intonation and practice drones. So we're going to talk about 3 things today that I think are pretty important and also really interesting, because we're going to discover that, if you don't know already, that intonation and pitch is not always fixed, and it's really malleable depending on what our frame of reference is. So the 3 things we're going to talk about today, kind of working up to that, are getting and keeping flutes in tune, how we do that, and then pitch tendencies once our flutes are in tune. And then we'll talk practice drones, not the drones that fly around in the sky, but the music drones that we would play to, and how we would use those and why. So the first thing, getting a flute in tune. In tune means that we are getting our flute to match A440 usually. A440, or in some places in the world, A442, tends to be the agreed upon note that means we are in tune. So A440 is a note that vibrates at 440 beats per second. And it's the lowest A you have on your flute. And actually, I'm going to play this one first. So if you play silver flute, let's tune to A440. If you're an Irish flute player, hang tight and I'll give you a trick in a second. So let's tune to A440. So I'm going to give you my A. Make sure your flute's pretty warmed up. Cool. I think that's close to A440. So if you were listening to me play that long A and going, what do I do? That's totally fine, and we'll talk about that. So what you want to do is you want to play your A and see if you can match mine. And if you're thinking, I can just do that with a tuner, you're absolutely right. But it's good to learn how to tune with ears as well, because tuners give us visual feedback, but we want auditory feedback as musicians. We want to develop our ears to a point where when we get auditory feedback, we are sure that it's very high quality feedback and we know how to process it and use it. So that's why I recommend learning to tune by ear as well. So the way you do that is when I play an A, kind of move your head up and down. That will manipulate the pitch up and down, like so. Okay? And wait for that moment when we seem to match. And what you're looking for is not hearing a lot of crunch and bumps in the sound. You're looking for something that feels smooth and pleasing, essentially. So here's an A again. Cool. So if you had to raise your chin or raise your whole head, that means you had to raise the pitch, which means you're flat. If you're flat, you push your head joint in. Okay, make sure you always hold it right at the joint when you do that. If you had to lower your head, that means you were sharp. You had to lower the pitch to match me. And if you're sharp, you pull your head joint out. Okay? Those same rules apply to this flute, but what I recommend with Irish flutes is the pitch tendencies of our A's tend to be pretty high. So I've noticed when I tune to an A, if I take that as gospel, if I tune to that A, the rest of my flute can be a little flat. So I tend to tune to D's instead. So here's a D. D is a more neutral note. So same thing, you want to just move up and down and see if you can match. Mm-hmm. If you were raising, that means you were flat, and so you want to push your head joint in. If you were lowering, that means you were sharp. You were lowering to meet my pitch, and that means you want to pull your head joint out. Okay? In terms of getting flutes in tune, that's a good start. In terms of keeping them in tune, you want to be aware that temperature really changes the intonation of flutes, particularly, I mean both of them, but I've noticed particularly with wooden flutes, they fluctuate really quickly in terms of temperature, the intonation does. So just keep tabs on the temperature of your head joint. If your head joint feels cold to the touch, you might be a little flat. If it feels hot, you might be sharp. And as you're playing, your flute's going to get hotter and hotter as you introduce your breath to the instrument. It will get warmer, it will expand, it will go sharp. So don't be afraid keep pulling your head joint out, that's totally fine. So once you have your flute in tune, and you're keeping it in tune, there are pitch tendencies. So that means that once the flute's generally in tune, there are certain notes in the scale that are still a little bit out. And different flutes have different tendencies on different notes, and different people might have different tendencies. But there's one in particular that we could talk about today as an example, and that's F sharp. And so on silver flutes, F sharp I think is pretty neutral, so it doesn't, at least on my flute, need a lot of manipulation to get it into tune. On Irish flutes, F sharp is really flat. It's really under pitch. And so that can be a little jarring if you're new to Irish flute or you've transitioned between the flutes. And you just have to kind of be aware of that. You can practice with a tuner. You can also practice with drones, which is what we're going to talk about how to do that. And this is why practicing with drones is so interesting. So that F sharp, that same F sharp that on our Irish flute is really flat, is not always that flat depending on what key we're playing in. So for instance, the third note of a scale, we often want to hear under pitch. So tuners and pianos operate by a system that I think of as being called equally tempered. So what that means is between each note is the exact same amount of space in terms of the pitch, okay? But our ears actually want to hear things in different places. Our ears aren't always mathematically exact. So where F sharp is always here on a tuner and on a piano, in the key of D, our ears actually want to hear it a little under. In the key of G, our ears actually want to hear it a little higher. So this is why drones are really useful. So if you are playing with a D drone, and let's do that, I'll pull up my D drone. I have D drones actually up on this channel, and I'll put up some G drones as well so you can experiment with it. But if we play with D drones, F sharp is the third note in a D major scale. So let's just go through those notes together. We have D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D. F sharp's the third note. We want to hear it a little bit lower below that equally tempered tuner perfect F sharp. So here's a D drone. And let's just practice playing our D scale to it. D, E, F sharp again. Okay, so if you're like me, you might have noticed that you had to bring your F sharp up a little bit, but not too much. And if we were playing against the G drone, for instance, which I'll put up on my channel so you can experiment with, you might notice that you have to raise that F sharp a lot because our ears want to hear the seventh note of a scale higher than that equally tempered perfect F sharp. So that is why playing with drones is so informative and interesting. And I think it's fascinating because it means pitch is really malleable and changeable. And it just depends, it all depends on the context, like much of the world and much of life. So what we could do is, here's our D drone again, and if you know Tobin's favorite, and I put a link to it in the bottom here, and there's also a link to it in the D drone practice drones on my channel. You should be able to get sheet music from my website. We can play along. You can play with a D drone. I'm going to turn the drone on. I'll play the tune once, and we'll see how it sounds. Awesome. So as you are playing there and as you're working on this with the drones in the background, make sure you listen down to them, and you'll notice that you might be making a lot of little adjustments as you go. And a lot of us do these adjustments pretty naturally without thinking about it. Our ears love context and they want to move that F sharp around depending on what we're playing it against. But just know that that F sharp is a little bit flat on your Irish flute, and you're going to have to figure out just how much you need to raise it depending on if you're in the key of D or the key of G. Okay, so we talked about getting your flute in tune, we talked about pitch tendencies, at least with F sharp, and we talked about how to use drones. So make sure you turn that drone on, and you can set it on loop, and you can play every single D major tune you know, and you can play your D major scale, and you can just have a really good time with it and feel like you're playing with a friend. So if you have any questions, drop me a comment, and I'll keep putting up videos. I have a couple requests from you guys for the next ones. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll talk to you soon. Happy fluting.